Shit, dropped my phone. Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of the Bolshevik Party in conflict, the left opposition, 1918. By Ronald I. Kowalski. Chapter 4 is titled The Agrarian Question. Just as Lenin's volte-face on foreign policy, or more precisely, his preparedness to accept a separate peace with Imperial Germany, had brought Lenin into conflict with the left communists, so too his abandonment of apparently agreed measures for the construction of socialism within Russia intensified and prolonged the clash. While the principal focus of this controversy was to be, as Robert Daniels has indicated, quote, the general's question of authority and discipline in the revolutionary society, particularly as applied to the organization of industry, end quote. It was not confined to that issue. Just as a side note, as I've been reading this, rereading this, or picking this book back up, is that I think that this is probably, based upon what I know I've learned thus far reading about the left communists, this is probably the best way to describe Rosa Luxemburg's position. And the piece with there's a piece on here by Michal Brie, who he wrote a book on Rosa Luxemburg, and I looked at some of the pieces from it. It's called like Rosa Luxemburg's Symphony for the Russian Revolution. And in that, he kind of talks about how, like, the Rosa Luxemburg kind of wanted, like, contradictory things. She wanted, like, an increase of, increased socialization accompanied by, like, increased democracy. So she was, like, very critical of, like, the Bolsheviks, like, anti-democratic maneuvers, you know, and so, including the abolition of the Constitutive Assembly, which that's probably actually a thing that she would probably disagree with the left communists on. I'm pretty sure they were pretty in favor of that. But she kind of had like a position of like, for instance, like did not like that the Bolsheviks were capitulating to peasant interests within the countryside. For instance, like breaking up the large estates into fragmented parcels of private property. That's basically, I'm pretty sure this is what this chapter is going to be about itself, but how like the only way to do that would be to stop what the peasants were doing themselves, like to radically reject the popular will of like the vast majority of the direct producers in the country, right? Obviously there's probably you know, some ways to mitigate this kind of like parcelization, and I don't know what they would be, but like that was one of her main critiques. So there's kind of like this tension in her critique of the Russian Revolution, in the piece The Russian Revolution, between like this desire for like an extension of like democracy, while at the same time encouraging the Bolsheviks to engage in practices in the countryside, implement an agrarian policy, which would have gone radically against the will of the people living in the countryside. So there's a tension there, and I think it kind of all comes down to like I think a lot of people found the Bolshevik Revolution very exciting. Even Kowalski at first, I think, found the Bolshevik Revolution for a second very exciting, insofar as it was preparing to he thought it viewed it as preparing to implement peace, but he thought the overthrow of the Constituent Assembly kind of like sealed the fate of the Bolshevik Revolution in terms of like, and made him like an opponent of it. but there's this, like but like without really kind of like thinking through the reality that like whatever might be the case about the play, whatever you might say about like capitalism being like a world system, and socialism being like the positive, like a positive transcendence of that world system into a new world system, right? And the fact that the Bolsheviks were banking on some kind of in very opaque ways, and we saw in the last chapter how like they didn't quite like, it was not quite clear how in Lenin's writings, like what the relationship between the Bolshevik Revolution and like these other revolutions were supposed to be, like how like there wasn't really anything of like, especially when you take into account the specificity of the Bolshevik Revolution, like who's going to lead this revolution, right? In the West, what was going to funnel the spontaneous insurgency of the workers into like a revolutionary overthrow of the system along Leninist lines, right? It's not really clear who's going to do that, and it seems like Lenin is pretty prepared for the isolation of the the Soviet Union or the Russian Revolution for some time to come, and thinks there's a lot of room for positive change within it. I don't know if you'd quite say socialism in one country, but I don't think the popular support for the position of socialism in one country came from nowhere. And it didn't just come from people who like knew nothing about Marxism or anything like that. But anyway, there's like a failure to like really. It seems like the main thing is that there's really, really a failure to account for just how backward Russia is. Like just how agrarian it truly is, and how uncapitalist that agrarianism is, right? And that's kind of like a thing that the Bolsheviks and the Soviet state is going to have a massive problem with, is like trying to industrialize the country, trying to maintain the support of the peasantry in some way, while also kind of like trying to get surpluses out of the peasantry in order to industrialize the country. They're going to have problems, and one of the problems they're going to have is that because agriculture is not capitalist, if there's no if they're not getting a good enough price from the Soviet state or from the cities, what they're going to do is just stop producing for the cities and stop selling. So they'll just hoard. They'll either hoard or just not produce, right? So if you were in a capitalist economy, if agriculture was fundamentally capitalist, they could not do that, right? They could not just like opt out of selling food to the city, right? And I'm pretty sure in like the pre Bolshevik era, in like the Tsarist period, there was something called grain captains, which kind of like acquired grain from the peasantry in the form of like a tax directly. They didn't sell it. It was like an in-kind taxation, and Bolsheviks eventually introduced like an in-kind taxation on the peasantry themselves. But if that's the way that food is getting from the country to the city, that's fundamentally not a capitalist mechanism. Now, in a socialist revolution, say like in the United States in 2025 or something like that, when so much of agriculture is not just capitalistically produced, but like under the big agro-capitalist firms, that would be a radically different enterprise. If you're trying to like socially appropriate those, than trying to concentrate a bunch of selective plots. So basically what the Stalinists end up doing, what the Stalinist USSR ultimately does, whereas Marx talks about the expropriation of the expropriators, right? Capitalism in its fullest development being fundamentally based on the expropriation of the direct producers in the form of the peasantry, but also kind of the concentration of capital in which, the petty, small commodity producers, whether you want to call them petty bourgeois, small businesses basically disappear and kind of is more and more concentrated in the Walmarts of the world. I know there was no Walmart in Marx's time, but from there it would be very easily when socialized production that's fundamentally socialized and like is concentrated in so few hands, expropriating those few individuals would not be that big of a deal. But so that that would be the expropriation of the expropriators. But in Russia, in the Stalinist period, they're just expropriating, right? They expropriate the direct producers, concentrate land into collective farms, which ostensibly will be more productive, and then concentrating those in, depending on how you understand the cold causes, which are distinct from Sov causes, which is like state farms. So the coal causes are a little bit different, and their ownership status in relation to the state is kind of unique. But basically, what they basically do, due to the fundamental backwardness of the country, and I don't think it was by no means think Stalinism was necessary. I agree with John Eric Merritt that the only thing that the Bolsheviks could have done to kind of like prevent Stalinism was maintain the NEP and try to democratize, to actually build up trade unions and Soviet power, re-democratize them if you can, or that would be the alternative, right, to Stalinism in his view, and I think there's a lot to that. But anyway, is that what I'm saying about why I'm referencing Stalinism when we're talking about something in 1918 is that there seems like a pretty big failure on the part of the left communists, the Bolsheviks in general. Like, it's not that they're unaware of it by any means, but to really take seriously how small the proletariat is in this country, and how backward the country actually is. Like, there's really seems like an act of a will to want capitalism to exist in Russia, to be able to say that capitalism exists in Russia, which it's not that it didn't at all, but it was highly concentrated in like the western portions of the country, of the empire, and it was highly concentrated in the western portions of the empire, and even there it was still, agriculture was largely peasant in character as opposed to capitalist in character. And if it was a capitalist in character, right, there wouldn't be a peasantry. There would be capitalist farmers and there would be capitalist day laborers, right, wage laborers, which is kind of an intermediary step that I think is kind of forgotten a lot of like Marxist historiography of like peasant societies, right, in the transition to capitalism, is like the fact that like a lot of times before there's this idea that the working class, the peasants are expropriated, they're either kicked off their farms or they they lose their traditional property rights, or property like customs, and they're kicked off the land, because they're tenants or whatever, and they lose their traditional land holding rights, right? And then they become urban proletariats. But usually, what happens is like, in addition to that more like classical form of like primitive accumulation that's discussed in the end of Capital Volume 1, there's also the process by which formerly independent peasants become agricultural wage laborers, right? Either like, and a big emphasis is on like wool and stuff, but also just in agriculture in general, right? And then with improvements in agriculture, right, there's a degree to which the agricultural population of the country becomes predominant, and there's enough food, there's enough food that can be sold cheaply in the cities to sustain a large urban proletariat. So, for agriculture to be substantially capitalist, it would actually have to be divided into capitalist an agrarian capitalist class and an agrarian proletariat, before there's any kind of like main large entry into the cities, right? So that's always something to think about when you're talking about whether agriculture or not is capitalist, right? Anyway, just saying, sorry for going on such a long rant in this video. I'm probably making it twice as long as it needs to be. But just kind of like thinking about like the degree to which Russia really how backwards Russia was, and how there's just seems like just a will not to really believe it. In January 1918, the left communists began to attack Lenin bitterly. Sorry, where am I? In fact, the first major instance of intra-party opposition to Lenin on an issue of domestic policy centered on the question of agriculture, a question much neglected certainly in Western studies. In January 1918, the left communists began to attack Lenin bitterly for what they saw to be his abject surrender to the petty bourgeois aspirations of the peasantry. This surrender was manifest in Lenin's readiness to carry out land reform largely along the lines traditionally advocated by the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionaries. Their program of land socialization had long been rejected by Russian Marxists of all persuasions, including Lenin, as fundamentally reactionary and inimical to any progress towards socialism in the countryside. Footnote. As V. Meshcheryakov commented during the debate preceding the implementation of the law on land socialization, Pravda, 24th of January 1918. Footnote. Given the shared legacy of antipathy to land socialization, it is little wonder that the left communists perceived themselves to be defending orthodox socialist principles, moreover, which the left communists believed had been incorporated in the Agrarian program adopted by the party in 1917. Hence, to locate the origins of this particular conflict, it is logical to examine how the thinking of the left communists and of Lenin too evolved on the question of agriculture during 1917. On the few occasions, however, that the left communists had addressed themselves to the issue in 1917, the left communists had displayed some hesitancy. On the morrow of the October Revolution, Bukharin, for one, conceded that the transformation of the countryside along socialist lines could not be achieved quickly. In general, agriculture was unlike industry, where the evolution of state capitalism had created a highly developed framework for the socialist organization of production. In Russia in particular, agriculture had not remotely approached the same level of capitalist development and concentration as industry had. This limited growth of capitalism was manifest in the continued predominance of small-scale peasant farming and the relative paucity of large capitalist estates. That's what I'm talking about right there. This limited growth of capitalism was manifest in the continued predominance of small-scale peasant farming and the relative paucity of large capitalist estates. Consequently, the basis for the extensive introduction of socialist methods of farming, which in common with most Marxists of their time they equated with large-scale collective agriculture, had not yet been laid. So there we go. I'm a genius. I know what I'm talking about. Yet at the same time, they did contend that significant changes had taken place in the countryside since 1906, when the party had last revised its agrarian program. First, the erosion of the old feudal estates of the gentry had been accelerated, partly as a consequence of the Stolypin reforms. Similarly, the Obstchina, the Mir, had been stripped of land in order to satisfy the demands of an emergent peasant bourgeoisie for large individual farms. Finally, the recent rise in grain prices after decades of decline had provided a marked stimulus to capitalist agriculture in Russia. While not amounting to a total economic transformation of the countryside, these developments meant that capitalism had made considerable advances there, particularly evident in the growing number of large pomeshchik estates run on capitalist lines. And pomeshchik means like landlord. And I don't know if it particularly refers to the nobility, but maybe more like the gentry, right? There's kind of like a important distinction to be made between the nobility and the gentry. Not all the gentry own land, but they're not like what's the word? They don't have like titles that may or may not guarantee them specific incomes, specific privileges, right? So, like, for instance, like in like if you think of like the French Revolution, I think I'm very stupid about the French Revolution, so don't quote me on it. But like I think in the French Revolution, one of the main things that it did was kind of like with the abolition of the monarchy, it fundamentally did something very similar to what's happening in Russia in this period, which is divide the estates up amongst the peasantry, right? I think one of the peasants were like one of the main, probably like lower caste groups, and they're constituting a huge portion of the country to benefit from the French Revolution due to the parcelization of land. And I think that remained the case. I think it remained the case for like 100 years and maybe well into the 20th century that there was a lot of very like small scale agriculture that was more or less, with varying degrees of market dependence uh, that existed in France in the wake of the French Revolution. So, like, I think the gentry, I think in like the classical instance of like England, for instance, the gentry were like people who like were able in one way or another to like purchase large swaths of land, but didn't have like the relationship to the state of being like a noble or like having some kind of title, right? They were just like big landowners. That doesn't mean they were necessarily capitalistic landowners. That just means they owned land. But I think the gentry generally were kind of a bit more on the vanguard. I'm not exactly sure, but on the vanguard of like promoting like capitalization in agriculture, kind of like charging like competitive rents as opposed to like tradition based rents, and things like that. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what I'm talking about here, but so the nobility, I think the Pemschik would have been like something comparable to like, I don't know. I think it's like a non-noble landowner, but I'm not sure. Anyway, but more than that, they emphasized that the essential character of the revolution in 1917 was quite different to what it had been in 1905 to 1906. Then, in the course of what was still a bourgeois democratic revolution against feudal absolutism, division of the large landed estates had been the appropriate policy to pursue. Land division, then, according to Ivan Skvortsov Stepanov, would have caused the, quote, destruction of pomeshchik land ownership, the prop of the old autocratic political order, unquote. Equally, by destroying the estates of the gentry which remained feudal, it would have removed the obstacles to the, quote, rapid development of agriculture through capitalism to socialism, end quote. However, in 1917, bourgeois democratic revolution had given way to socialist revolution. This change, too, had to be taken into account in framing agrarian policy. As Skvortsov Stepanov initiated in April 1917 at the Secondary City Party Conference in Moscow. Land division was no longer a suitable course of action. Rather than facilitate the transformation of the countryside along socialist lines, it would do nothing but destroy what progress had been made and surrender, quote, agriculture quote, agriculture into the power of petty bourgeois illusions, end quote. In these circumstances, they insisted that nationalization of the land, encompassing the confiscation of pomeshchik and church estates, was essential to destroy the economic power of counter-revolutionary forces in the countryside. It was even more vital, however, to ensure that those farms which had become capitalist, in particular the large estates, were preserved intact. They would form the initial links in a slowly growing chain of large-scale collective socialist agriculture. At the same time, the poor peasants were to be encouraged to unite and set up their own collectives, presumably to be provided with the needed equipment and seed stocks by the revolutionary state. No other policy would establish the foundations for the future development of socialism in agriculture. Land division must be avoided at all costs, as Bukharin had stressed at the Six-Party Congress in summer 1917, in particular lest it produce a large class of, quote, satiated, quote, peasant proprietors who would desert the revolution to defend their newly won property. Moreover, land division would reverse the stratification that he believed had intensified recently in the countryside, the division of the peasantry into a bourgeois minority and pauperized majority. The pauperized majority itself becoming increasingly proletarianized, according to Innokenty Stukov, was alone considered to be a reliable ally of the proletariat and was to be encouraged to conduct a class war against the landlords and their richer capitalist neighbors in the interest of consolidating the revolution. For all Lenin's, quote, awareness, uncommon among Russian Marxists of his time, for all Lenin's, quote, awareness, parenthesis, uncommon among Russian Marxists of his time, in parenthesis, that Russian revolutionaries could not very well ignore the peasant majority of the population, end quote. For much of 1917, Lenin gave no clear indication of the compromises that Lenin would become prepared to make to secure the support of the peasants for, or, at the very least, quote, neutralize, end quote, their opposition to a seizure of power by the Bolsheviks. Footnote. C. E. Kingston Mann, Lenin and the Problem of Marxist Peasant Revolution, and J.L.H. Keep, The Russian Revolution, A Study in Mass Mobilization. And footnote. On Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917, in the April Theses, Lenin baldly outlined the agrarian program that Lenin believed the party must now adopt. Quote, the weight of the emphasis in the agrarian program to be shifted to the Soviets of agricultural laborers' deputies. Confiscation of all landed estates. Wait, did I say quote? I feel like I didn't say quote. He baldly outlined the agrarian program that Lenin believed the party must now adopt. Quote, the weight of the emphasis in the agrarian program to be shifted to the Soviets of agricultural laborers' deputies, confiscation of all landed estates, nationalization of all lands in the country, the land to be disposed of by the local Soviets of agricultural laborers and peasants' deputies, the organization of separate Soviets of deputies of poor peasants, the setting up of a model farm on each of the large estates, ranging in size from 100 to 300 desiatines, according to local and other conditions, and to the decisions of the local bodies, under the control of the Soviets of agricultural laborers' deputies, and for the public account, end quote. Lenin. I'm assuming that's the April Theses? No, it isn't the April Theses. It is the April Theses. Lenin frankly admitted that nationalization of the land per se did not amount to socialism. During the April conference, Lenin conceded that far from being incompatible with capitalism, land nationalization was, quote, a grand bourgeois project, end quote. But while not socialist in itself, nevertheless it remained progressive. Not only would nationalization, quote, representing as nationalization does the abolition of private ownership of the land, deal such a powerful blow to private ownership of all the means of production in general, end quote. It would also destroy, quote, feudalistic big land ownership and all the feudal fetters of the entire system of land ownership and land tenure, end quote. Lenin. April Theses. The destruction of feudalism would hasten the process of class polarization in the countryside, already much accelerated by the Stolypin reforms. The peasants would become stratified ever more clearly into, on the one hand, a small minority of wealthy proprietors, a peasant bourgeoisie, and on the other hand, a large majority of poor semi-proletarian peasants and agrarian agricultural laborers. The latter, Lenin insisted, were to be organized in separate Soviets and won over to the side of the urban proletariat to advance the revolution towards socialism. At the same time, he warned the party against harboring any illusions about the prospects for the immediate introduction of socialism in Russia, especially in the countryside. Again, at the April conference, he scathingly dismissed any such thinking as, quote, the height of absurdity, end quote. In a country where, quote, the majority of the population are peasants, small farmers who can have no idea of socialism, end quote. Lenin. Yet Lenin also had no illusions about the future of small-scale peasant farming. Lenin, too, as the majority of Marxists of Lenin's time, was convinced that peasant farming was doomed to extinction in face of competition from large-scale mechanized agriculture, just as small-scale manufacturing had increasingly been displaced by large-scale industrial production. Lenin reiterated what Lenin had argued repeatedly before 1917, that, quote, small-scale farming under commodity production, bracket, could, and bracket, not save mankind from poverty and depression, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. In 1906, in his revision of the Agrarian program of the Workers' Party, Lenin concluded with a warning against, quote, small-scale ownership, which cannot, so long as commodity production exists, abolish poverty among the masses, end quote. End footnote. In Russia in particular, land division was no solution to the impoverishment of the countryside. In the first place, there was insufficient land to provide all the rural poor with an adequate plot, and in the second place, it would prove impossible to supply them with the livestock, equipment, and seed reserves required for proper cultivation. For Lenin, the only solution to this problem and the only basis for the eventual socialist restructuring of the countryside remained the development of large-scale collective agriculture. At the caucus of Bolshevik delegates to the All-Russian Conference of Soviets on April 4th, at the April Conference, even in the face of peasant skepticism at the first Congress of Peasant Deputies in May, Lenin insisted on the preservation of the existing large estates intact for common cultivation, and, in fact, not so large estates as 100 desiatines was, according to E.H. Carr, quote, a low limit for that category, end quote. E.H. Carr. They were to become the foundations of the socialist agriculture of the future. Lenin hastened to emphasize, however, that collective cultivation, while a, quote, difficult business, end quote, could not be imposed upon the peasants by fiat. Lenin anticipated the superiority of large-scale mechanized farming would induce the peasants, quote, by force of example, end quote, to embrace such a system voluntarily. Quite logically, Lenin was then able to reassure the small and middle peasants that the continuation of the revolution towards socialism would not necessitate the forcible expropriation of the peasants' property. The prescriptions outlined by Lenin in his April theses and all their essentials were adopted as policy by the party at its April conference, although not without some dissent. A.I. Rykov, for one, question, quote, with paralyzing ideological consistency, end quote, as Esther Kingston Mann has wryly remarked, whether it was at all realistic to contemplate winning the peasantry, petty bourgeois proprietors all over to the cause of socialist revolution. N.S. Angarsky, too, cast doubts on Lenin's understanding of peasant aspirations, suggesting that what the peasants sought was not nationalization but the transfer of the land into their own possession. And later, at the Six-Party Congress, Evgeny Preobrazhensky expressed additional reservations from the left. Preobrazhensky asked what a policy designed to foster an alliance between the proletariat and the poorest peasants in fact meant, as no one yet had defined precisely who the poorest peasants were or how an alliance with the poorest peasants was to be made effective. Such concerns notwithstanding, there did not seem to be any serious basis for a major split between Lenin and the left of the party on the question of agriculture. They appeared to be in agreement on the broad, if at sometimes nebulous lines of what the party's agrarian policy should be. From the late summer, however, Lenin began to espouse increasingly, quote, heretical views on agriculture. In all probability, news of an escalation in seizures of gentry estates land by the peasants led Lenin to reflect anew on what their aspirations were. Lenin's reappraisal was self-confessedly shaped by the model mandate, the peasant mandate on the land published in Izvestia on the 19th of August. Based on the 242 resolutions which various peasant organizations had submitted to the First Congress of Peasant Deputies, indicating the changes that they sought in the countryside. On the 29th of August, he signaled his willingness to bow to this expression of peasant demands to win their support. From a publicist's diary, Peasant Workers, Lenin conceded that, quote, we the Bolsheviks can and will give you what the peasant poor want and are searching for, end quote. In essence, Lenin was now prepared to accept land socialization, including, quote, equalized distribution of land among the working people, unquote, which hitherto he had categorically resisted. Still clinging to his belief in the superiority of large-scale agriculture, Lenin thus added that, quote, the highly efficient farms must not be, quote, divided up, end quote, presumably in the hope of preserving them as the oasis of collective agriculture in a desert of petty peasant farms. Lenin justified his continued defense of model farms by reference to the third and fourth points of the peasant mandate, where demands for the preservation of the advanced specialist estates were expressed. Footnote: days before the revolution, Lenin again charged that the peasants sought, quote, the conversion of land tracts farmed on a highly efficient level, orchards, plantations, etc., into, quote, model farms, end quote. Their transfer to, quote, the exclusive use of the state and the communes, end quote. I am grateful to Maureen Perry for drawing my attention to the specific references to model farms in the peasant mandate and Lenin's own citing of them. End footnote. Yet he was to downplay, publicly at least, any emphasis on collective agriculture. Lenin's work, The Tasks of the Revolution, for instance, written in September, contained no reference to the preservation of model estates. As Lenin openly admitted shortly after the Bolsheviks came to power, he had shifted his ground on the question of agrarian policy. Just as peace was, quote, not a Bolshevik policy, end quote, but that of the majority of the population, so too was the decree on land which had been, quote, taken bodily from peasant mandates, end quote. With characteristic vigor, Lenin justified his change of tack. The victory of the revolution, he argued, demanded that the party yield to peasant aspirations, but he hastily and rather sanguinely continued, the party could do so certain in the knowledge that land division was not fundamentally inimical to the eventual transition to socialism in the countryside, especially in a country such as Russia, where large-scale farming remained far from predominant. Provided power remained, quote, in the hands of the workers and peasants' government, if workers' control has been introduced, the banks nationalized, a supreme economic body set up to regulate the entire economic life of the country, end quote, then the future of socialism would be secure. At this stage in the revolution, Lenin had apparently neglected to consider fully what obstacles the creation of a, quote, satiated and a less stratified peasantry might pose for the construction of socialism in Russia, as well as the immediate impact of land division on agrarian productivity. Despite this retreat and the absence of overt references to, quote, model estates, Lenin had not abandoned his ultimate commitment to large-scale collective agriculture. The land socialization law of February 1918 was not quite a total surrender. While sanctioning, quote, distribution of the land among the toilers on an equal basis, end quote, it also sought, quote, to encourage the collective system of agriculture at the expense of individual farming, the former being more economical and leading to socialist economy, end quote, and to establish, quote, model farms and experiment stations, end quote. Lenin. At the Seventh Party Congress in March, Lenin again insisted that the Soviet government, despite its agreement to land distribution, would continue to, quote, give preference to communes and big labor cooperatives, end quote. Lenin. In the first months after the revolution, however, these commitments mainly remained, Jesus Christ. In the first months of the revolution, however, these commitments remained largely statements of intent, and in practice, as Wesson has pointed out, little was done to foster the development of collective agriculture. Footnote, see R.G. Wesson's Soviet Communes, published in 1963. And footnote. The left communists had no doubt that Lenin had compromised party policy. Jesus Christ. Unconvinced by Lenin's defense of his volte-face in the first months of 1918, the left communists openly assailed Lenin for his acceptance of what was essentially the agrarian program of the socialist revolutionaries, for what, in their minds, was an abrogation of socialist principles. One of the left communist opponents encapsulated with commendable brevity and accuracy the essence of their critique. Quote, the new land law is characterized by the majority of its critics as a reactionary act. The new land law's reactionary character is seen chiefly in that the new land law opens the way to small-scale farming, that the new land law creates and increases the number of, quote, petty farms, that the new land law produces an inevitable shift of all agriculture towards a natural economy, which inevitably entails a fall in its productivity, end quote. M. Deesky. I think that's what's being said there. I don't know. Such objections were articulated most cogently and forcefully by Preobrazhensky. Preobrazhensky contended that, quote, the chief task, end quote, facing the new Soviet government in the countryside, quote, after the liquidation of the Pomeshchik land ownership, end quote, was, quote, the reconstruction of agriculture on socialist lines, end quote. Preobrazhensky. Regrettably, Preobrazhensky continued, the projected land socialization law did but little, if anything, to further this objective. Even worse, it threatened to destroy whatever progress already had been made in this direction. Convinced that large-scale agriculture was more productive than small-scale farming, Preobrazhensky condemned the projected land law for the projected land law's failure even to preserve the existing large estates. Quote, the protection of capitalist farms from disintegration and the capitalist farms' transfer intact into the hands of the Soviets has not been envisaged. On the contrary, there is a point about rewarding the batraki with land. The hell is batraki? Wikipedia says Batraki is a rural locality, a village in Ime Karmelinsky. Oh, that's a place. I don't know. Not finding anything good for Batraki. On the contrary, there is a point about rewarding the Batraki with land, which presupposes the breaking up of such farms into small allotments. This is both fundamentally reactionary from the economic point of view and deeply unjust to the agricultural proletariat, end quote. Preobrazhensky. Developing his argument rather ironically in a manner reminiscent of that of Lenin in the spring of 1917, Preobrazhensky proceeded to outline the economic consequences which Preobrazhensky was certain would follow from land division. The majority of the peasants, especially the poor, had insufficient stocks of feed, tools, and especially drought power to work effectively any allotments of land granted to them. If the large estates were parceled out amongst them, there could be only one outcome: the precipitate fall in production in the countryside. In turn, urban Russia, already suffering hunger because of the destructive impact of war on agrarian productivity, would become threatened even more gravely with starvation. In these difficult circumstances, Preobrazhensky concluded, the Soviet government, quote, could not allow itself the luxury of uncontrolled small-scale agriculture, end quote. Preobrazhensky. Skvortsov-Stepanov shared and later expanded upon Preobrazhensky's fears. Equalizing the division of land amongst the peasantry, Skvortsov-Stepanov agreed would lead to an immediate fall in productivity. But in the longer term, land socialization would be economically retrogressive too. The modern equipment already present in the countryside, as well as any additional flow of machinery that might follow upon the demobilization of industry when the war ended, could not be used optimally unless the existing large estates were preserved and new collectives created. The economies of scale that mechanization promised could be achieved only on very large farms, not in a system of peasant smallholdings. Land socialization, which amounted to the destruction of all the large estates, would not only bring back a considerably less efficient mode of production to rural Russia, but also would thwart any technical advance there. Future progress towards a more efficient system of large-scale mechanized agriculture would be precluded, and any potential for socialist transformation of the countryside virtually eliminated. The left communist opposition to land socialization, however, was not simply the product of narrow economic concerns. Their fears of its political consequences were equally, if not more pronounced, echoing the anxieties voiced by Bukharin at the Six-Party Congress. Heirs to the virulent anti-peasantism embodied in Russian Marxism, they mistrusted, even feared the peasants, whom they considered to be inalienably hostile to socialism. As Preobrazhensky rather scornfully claimed, the peasantry, comprising myriads of atomized small property holders, could not be considered to be a socialist class, a theme echoed and expanded later by Bukharin in his major treatise on sociology, Historical Materialism. They believed the peasants to be immured in, quote, the idiocy of rural life, and, quote, in the main ignorant, politically naive, and vulnerable to reactionary influences. Footnote. In Historical Materialism, Bukharin argued, quote, in other words, the peasantry, for instance, lack several elements necessary to make them a communist class. The peasantry are bound down by property, and it will take many years to train the peasants to a new view, which can only be done by having the state power in the hands of the proletariat. Also, the peasantry are not held together in production, in social labor, and common action. On the contrary, the peasant's entire joy is in his own bit of land. The peasant is accustomed to individual management, not to cooperation with others, end quote. Bukharin. End footnote. It was imperative, therefore, to resist land socialization. If implemented in the short term, all that it would achieve would be to destroy the only reliable allies of the urban proletariat in the countryside, the batraki. It's weird there. I don't really like the use of the word socialization here. I'm not really quite sure what land socialization means. Does it just mean land redistribution? In Marxist vocabulary, at least, socialization means something different. It becomes the property of the whole community, not just like the property of a singular community or a singular private proprietor, right? It's not a term that is consistent with the concept of private property. It's not just redistribution. I feel like that's the word that should be used, is redistribution. Anyway, it was imperative, therefore, to resist land socialization. If implemented in the short term, all that it would achieve would be to destroy the only reliable allies of the urban proletariat in the countryside, the batraki. The grant of land to these rural laborers would transform them into petty proprietors, opposed to further advances to socialism. The middle peasants, too, would gain land and would tenaciously defend their enlarged plots. In sum, the swelling in the ranks of the peasantry would so strengthen the forces of counter-revolution as to pose immense obstacles to the introduction of collective socialist agriculture in the future. In the long term, the impact of land socialization would be, if anything, more pernicious. Millions of peasants who would have been allotted land would be unable to work it as they would lack the means to do so. The government itself did not possess the equipment, livestock, and seed to alleviate all the existing shortages. In consequence, the land would gradually fall into the hands of the more prosperous peasants who did have the wherewithal to work it. Land division, therefore, was a myopic policy. Rather than benefiting the poor and exploited peasants, in the long term it simply planted the seeds for the eventual reemergence of capitalism in the countryside. Their socio-political objections to land socialization have been reduced to the fact, quote, that the new law, impregnated as it is with individualism, disunites the laboring peasant masses, atomizes the laboring peasant masses, and opens the door wide for the creation of a rural petty bourgeoisie, which, economically backward and feeble, is a very reactionary class, everywhere, always, and in every respect, end quote. M. Deesky. To minimize the threat of peasant reaction and to promote the development of socialism in the countryside, the left communists in the main, those in the Ukraine remained something of an exception, as we shall see in Chapter 7 below, defended what, with some justification, they believed party policy to have been in 1917. In their theses on the current situation, contained a bald statement of the left communists' continuing objectives, if one lacking in details of how they were to be achieved. Quote, the organization in the countryside of an attack by the poor peasants on the rich, the development of large-scale socialized agriculture, and support for modes of working the land by poor peasants, which are transitional to socialized agriculture, end quote. Earlier in January and February, in the midst of the controversy over the land socialization law, Preobrazhensky had begun to articulate what such a policy would involve, developing ideas elaborated during 1917. Preobrazhensky argued, first, that the large capitalist estates must be preserved intact. The large capitalist estates were to be transferred to the control of the local Soviets, who were to make the necessary arrangements for their collective cultivation by the batraki. Second, poor peasants who lacked the drought power, equipment, and seed stocks to work the land independently were to be organized into artels. The state would provide the means for cultivation and so check the tendency for the land of such peasants to fall into the hands of their rich neighbors. Third, migration was to be encouraged, specifically the resettlement of poor peasants onto land especially prepared for them by the state. Again, they were to work this land collectively with resources provided by the state. The left communists appear to have recognized that in themselves these measures would not be sufficient to transform the countryside along socialist lines. Certainly, the development of large-scale collective agriculture would increase productivity. But as one of their critics repeatedly pointed out, socialism demanded more, that all production, agrarian as well as industrial, be regulated according to a general plan for the entire economy. He conceded that the more large estates were there, the easier it would be to plan for the agrarian sector. Nevertheless, if socialism was to be achieved, the plan had to be extended to incorporate the remaining small peasant farms too. While aware of the need for this degree of planning, the left communists failed to explain quite how they envisioned to achieving it. Jesus Christ. In a manner somewhat reminiscent of Hilferding, Bukharin expressed the vague hope that once Soviet control over industry was established, then the incorporation of even small peasant farming into the sphere of general organization of production and would inevitably develop. Preobrazhensky too recognized the vital role of planning. Preobrazhensky argued for a strict state monopoly over all trade in grain, a crucial part of a more general scheme for planned distribution of all resources. Preobrazhensky contended that such a system would serve to ensure that the economic interests of both the poor peasants and the proletariat were protected. Preobrazhensky rather lamely concluded, however, that, quote, here is not the place to talk of how to implement this plan, end quote. Preobrazhensky. The left communists frankly admitted that implementation of their program was dependent upon, quote, the organization of socialist class struggle, end quote, in the countryside. It was essential to win over not just the poor peasant majority, but also the bulk of the middle peasantry to undertake such a course of action. These peasants, they concluded rather sanguinely, would come to realize that the gains made by them during the revolution could only be secured by lining up firmly behind the urban proletariat and eliminating their capitalist and counter-revolutionary neighbors in the countryside. In sum, all these measures were seen to be the prerequisites for the, quote, socialist reconstruction of agriculture, and, quote, guaranteeing the collectivism that Preobrazhensky and others on the left regarded as essential for socialism. Any other policy would simply create a fertile breeding ground for individual farming and the reinforcement of petty bourgeois attitudes. Not only was it inappropriate in principle for any socialist government, wittingly or unwittingly, to permit such developments to take place, more seriously, they would prove to be fatal for the revolution. As we have seen in Chapter 3, the left communists were terrified by what the left communists saw as the corruptive influence of the peasantry on the prosecution of socialist objectives by the Soviet government. This influence was all-pervasive, not simply confined to the question of agriculture. For the left, the preparedness of Lenin and Lenin's faction to accept a separate peace with Germany had been but one instance of a more general compromise of socialist principles to peasant prejudices. Even more troubling, they were certain that such sacrifices soon would extend further. In the spring, Karl Radek rather gloomily reiterated their very worst fears, quote, and the victory of proletarian revolution in Europe may allow the proletarian minority in Russia to place the peasantry on socialist rails. The absence of this revolution can cast the proletariat from power. If the Soviet government, standing on the point of view of a dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, takes into account the numerical and social preponderance of the peasantry, then it will proceed to a compromise with capital, a compromise acceptable from the point of view of the peasantry, but a compromise which destroys the socialist character of the revolution and therefore unacceptable to the proletariat, end quote. Karl Radek. New section. Many of the left's communist fears concerning the impact of the government's agrarian policy were well-founded. The economic criticisms which they leveled against land socialization had considerable foundation. It finally destroyed the large estates which had produced, according to Mala, an estimated, or Malay, I don't know how to say that. I have a piece by him on war communism on the channel, this person. An estimated 70% of all marketed grain before the war. Hence, in the short run, the potential surplus, or at least the most easily attainable surplus, that hitherto had gone to feed the towns appeared to have been significantly reduced, so exacerbating the already serious food crisis in urban Russia. This situation was made yet worse by the fact that livestock and farm equipment were not redistributed to the same extent as the land. Lack of these resources prevented many peasants in consequence from being able to work the land they had newly acquired, so diminishing vital production even further. In the long term, it also reduced what Lev Kritzman termed, quote, the agrarian base of industry in the towns, end quote. Lev Kritzman. What he meant was that peasant farming, particularly within the confines of the economically backward communes, now revived in larger numbers than ever, would produce much less of a surplus, which could be tapped for the development of Russian industry than with large-scale agriculture. Politically, the short-term impact of the equalized land division was to strengthen the ranks of the middle peasantry, with a corresponding reduction in the numbers of poor and landless peasants. Siberia and much of Ukraine remained exceptions, with marked inequalities in landholding persisting. Despite the fact that the bulk of the peasants received little additional land, in most instances less than 1 desiatin, despite the fact that livestock and equipment were not redistributed equally, nevertheless land socialization, encompassing not just the estates of the gentry but also those kulaks who had set up large holdings outside the commune, had served to reduce differentiation within the peasantry. Consequently, the villages were considerably more homogeneous than before, more united and resistant to Bolshevik efforts, rather utopian efforts as it transpired, to fan the flames of class war in the countryside in the spring and summer of 1918. Much of Bukharin's gloomy prophecy at the Six-Party Congress seemed to have been fulfilled. That's a I don't really know much about kulaks or like the concept of the rich peasant before 1917, but I know that like the class differentiation amongst the peasantry, as was being said here, was very much the hierarchy between the stratification of the peasantry what became shrunk in this period. But yeah, this dilemma is something I think is going to happen up until the Stalin period. Is that like they're like the rural countrysides that they always tried to like, not only did they try to stoke class war in the countryside, but they also said that there was class war in the countryside. There was like they tried to like fan the flames of this, right? But actually speaking, is there's like a great deal of like solidarity in the peasant communities, up to their destruction and collectivization, right? And that was one of the projects of collectivization, was to break that kind of solidarity which existed between and that's the degree to which inequality had been diminished in the countryside, is that peasants, they were what's the word? To the degree to which they were successful in the NEP would have been more or less successful than others. There was still sufficiently, a sufficient flattening of the peasantry in terms of internal differentiation in terms of income and wealth, that there was still basis for solidarity within the peasant commune against the Soviets, or not the peasant commune, but like the peasant villages and the peasant localities against the Soviet state. During the spring and early summer of 1918, Lenin himself increasingly came to share many of their concerns, so much so that Lenin again markedly changed the direction of Bolshevik policy towards the peasants. Increasing difficulty in keeping the towns fed were at the root of the change of tack, and he frequently professed. By early June, Lenin finally conceded that, quote, serious famine has driven us to a purely communist task, a revolutionary socialist task, end quote, in the countryside. Despite the swinging losses of grain-producing areas flowing from the Brest Peace, losses which greatly exacerbated the food crisis, Lenin optimistically concluded that sufficient grain remained to feed the people, albeit, quote, only just enough, end quote. The cause of the food crisis was the selfishness of the peasants. Quote, many millions of petty property owners, the petty bourgeois element, who look at everything from the standpoint of their own narrow interests, end quote, Lenin, manifest in their unwillingness to surrender their grain surpluses. Lenin's solution to this problem was to adopt what were essentially left communist policies. In a certain desperation, Lenin now urged the intensification of the class struggle in the countryside. Lenin's intent was to win over the poor peasants whom Lenin alleged with no small degree of exaggeration in a letter of 26th of July to Clara Setkin, quote, everywhere, ... are for us, end quote, to support the workers in attacking the kulaks and appropriating the surplus in their possession. At the same time, considerably more attention was to be paid to establishing collective forms of agriculture. The period of compromise with the peasantry was over. In early July at the Fifth All-Russian Congress of Soviets, Lenin candidly conceded that the Bolsheviks, quote, may have made a mistake in embodying your, bracket, SR, and bracket, socialization of the land in our law, end quote. Lenin. It could appear that much of the left communist critique of land socialization had been vindicated, yet the problem remains that their own policies could not be successfully implemented in the Russian countryside of 1918. Even disregarding the question whether Russia had the technology that their strategy demanded, and it is certain that it did not possess the equipment required for the extensive introduction of large-scale mechanized agriculture, there was also the intractable problem of peasant attitudes. Whatever the Soviet government, any government might have desired, the overwhelming majority of the peasants desired the implementation of their long-sought cherny peredel, the equal division of all the land, as Lenin had come to accept during the summer of 1917. No government, then, had the power to impose upon the peasants policies which they felt to be unacceptable, as the provisional government had discovered to its dismay in 1917. No government, too, could foment class war amongst the peasants, who in the main united to resist the pressures from without the village. See, that's what I'm talking about right there. Bluntly, peasant attitudes were antipathetic to left communist visions of socialist agriculture. Again, and this is sorry, just a side note. Like, this is the reason. This is part, like, when I was talking about earlier in this video about how, like, peasant agriculture had not become capitalist, right? Is that why? I think one of the fundamental reasons why Marx thought that capitalist development was necessary for socialism was the fact that was because in socialism, then it would be a small number of proprietors that would be expropriated by the overwhelming majority in the interests of the immense majority, and enable a greater degree of democratic self-activity among the direct producers, right? I think that's like one of the reasons why he thinks that capitalist development is necessary. Also, he thinks like abundance. He has ideas about like abundance being like a necessary precondition for like any kind of for like a classless society. Which people debate with the whole idea of like Stone Age economics, right? The original affluence, how there was like in primitive societies with way less material abundance, they were able to have relatively egalitarian relationships among themselves. So the question of to what degree, how much abundance is needed for a classless society is debatable. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. But one of the reasons that Marx thinks that like capitalism needs to be fully developed in order to for a revolution, for socialist transition to take place, is precisely for this reason, so that what the private property is expropriated is the private property of the few for the benefit of the many, right? The immense majority against a tiny minority, against immense majority against a tiny minority, right? And that's and I think that's one of the reasons, like that. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. What I'm trying to say is that, in order for in a lot of these what's over? God, I'm fucking up. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Is that you wouldn't be expropriating the direct producers, right? Capitalism expropriates the direct producers. The socialism is the direct producers expropriating the the small non-producing class, right? That is what fundamentally what socialism does, right? But in this instance, what ends up being happening in Stalinism and even in here is like this attempt to like expropriate small, like direct producers who privately possess their means of production, right? So in this instance, you can't really you see immediately off the bat, like this struggle. Obviously, they're in the midst of civil war, and then they're about to be in civil war. I can't remember when the civil war starts proper. I guess you could say the civil war initiated with the Bolshevik seizure of power, but like they're all very struggling with the fact, like immediately, with the fact of their backwardness, and not just not just on a technical level, but on a social level as well, right? And I think that, yeah, so like when people say things like, look how Marx was proven wrong, socialist transformation, socialist revolution actually happened in backward countries. He was wrong. It wasn't necessary. It's like, well, it proved to be pretty goddamn necessary, because to actually implement anything in collectivizing property, what the states fundamentally did was expropriate the direct producers, right, and turn them into wage laborers in most cases, either on the collective farms or in the cities, right? So, in order for the transition from a collective form, from a society based on, private property, to a society that abolishes private property and abolishes classes, in order for that not to just be like a total human disaster, it would have to be, it would have, like, the expropriation would have to take on this majoritarian character, right? Not the state mass expropriating millions of small peasants, right? That's not that wasn't an emancipatory move into an emancipatory direction. All it did was create like inflate the number of exploited wage workers in the Soviet Union, right? So it wasn't. So yeah, like there is a lot there. It's not just Marx just thinking, being stupid, or just saying like being uncreative when he says that socialism requires like a developed capitalism for it to take off, right? And I think, and in my opinion, this kind of like, I think a lot of times like the dialectic, I don't really like using that word, but it seems like apt when you're talking about this, in the way that you talk about like the dialectic capitalism, the progressive elements of capitalism, and its relation to socialism is kind of lost due to this idea which is, I think, is initiated by the Bolshevik Revolution, that you could create socialism or like have a socialist revolution in a backward country, prior to any kind of revolution that happens elsewhere, right? I think when you lose the fundamental, I don't know. All right, sorry, I'm talking too long. I stayed up too late. I'm getting delirious. Bluntly, pleasant attitudes were antipathetic to left communist visions of socialist agriculture. As Clementi acidly remarked, their program simply was not feasible since, quote, the subjective conditions for the socialist reorganization of agriculture, ... have not yet appeared, end quote. M. Meshcheryakov elaborated upon this theme, quote, but what is really possible to undertake in November as an immediate task? I'm going to repeat that. M. Meshcheryakov elaborated upon this theme, quote, but was it really possible to undertake in November as an immediate task the bringing about of socialism, the system of socialized labor on socialized land? Everybody can understand that this was not possible. ... The peasant masses have no idea what socialism means and want only a free additional allotment of land on egalitarian principles. We had to accept the program as it was, ... end quote. Conceding that he still believed that land socialization was, quote, a considerable improvement on the old order, end quote, he nevertheless concluded that, regrettably, there was, quote, not a grain of socialism in it, end quote. V. Meshcheryakov. In these circumstances, there was little likelihood of the left communist-owned program being accepted by the peasantry. Short of arresting the millions of peasants who did not realize where their true interest lay, as Bukharin was alleged to have professed on the morrow of the October Revolution, a task well beyond the Bolshevik strength, they had little choice but to bow to the reality of the Russian countryside. Their continuing failure during the period of war communism to mold the countryside as they desired led to further compromises with and concessions to the peasants in the NEP period until the late 1920s. Stalin grasped the nettle and brutally coerced the peasantry into accepting a policy in many respects similar to that advocated by the left communists in 1918. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.